much of what we can do in terms of mandatory vaccinations are actually based on what is the current condition around COVID-19. So what are the risks and how can we navigate them? We'll go through kind of this first question, which I think we should all kind of go through, which is, should all businesses consider possible vaccinations in the workplace? So even if we end up working out that we don't need to or we can't, should every business still ask that question? We'll go through that test to work out, can we actually direct employees to get vaccinated mandatorily? We'll look at, are there any alternatives to mandatory vaccinations? What are the risks and liabilities if we are to push ahead with that approach? Go through our top tips, and then also our Q&A. And I thought it might be helpful before we even get out on these slides to kind of push out a poll to see kind of, is there even appetite amongst the people on this webinar to push out a mandatory vaccination or not? Just so we can kind of see before we even get started what the appetite is. And then it will be on an anonymous basis. There'll be 3 questions that pop up that just did then. So please feel free to answer that. And hopefully we'll just get some results to give us a bit of a flavour for kind of where we're at as workplaces in terms of this question. Do we want to introduce a mandatory vaccination policy or not? So I'll just give it a few seconds just for people to answer if they'd like to. And then it'll just be displayed. Again, it's all anonymous, so there are no screenshots and sharing with people. Okay, so we have, as you can see, over 50% are keen. We have about 20% that do not want to introduce a policy, and we have about 30% that are unsure. So that's a really great spread, and these slides are kind of being prepared with those potentialities in check. So hopefully by the end of this, we can potentially change some of those onshore to maybe be a lower number. So yeah, it'll just be interesting to see how that happens, but happy to kind of get started now. In terms of the objectives, really keen for everyone to kind of leave you knowing more about mandatory vaccinations, whether they can do it, kind of arm you with the information to go off and do a lot of the legwork yourself to try to ascertain if your business can actually require vaccinations. And then also just to kind of give you more info in terms of what are the potential risks and liabilities so that we can kind of make informed decisions, because there is absolutely no way you can introduce a mandatory vaccination policy with 0 risk. But it's really important that we know what those risks are and how much of a risk it is, so we can then kind of make that call and feel comfortable. So in terms of the current landscape, I'm really not keen to kind of go into a big song and verse on COVID-19. Everybody probably wakes up in the morning, first thing they do is look at the news. It's been just taking over news stations over the past 2 years almost. So really just wanted to go through some really quick stats, because this is relevant in terms of vaccinations, because as we'll get through, one of the considerations around vaccinations is what is the current risk or what is the current exposure around COVID-19. So these stats actually do help us work out that assessment. So purely we can see on a 7-day average, we are spiking in terms of COVID-19. We are at the pinnacle of COVID-19 cases that we've seen in Australia thus far. Although I'm hoping that downwards little divot at the very top is the trend. We just have to know that now is actually a really heightened sense of risk with COVID-19 from purely a contracting numbers point of view. It's really interesting to know at the moment just who is contracting COVID-19. So I put up a couple of statistics there. Hopefully you can read them. It shows just the spread of ages that are actually getting COVID-19. And surprisingly, it's largely the group at the moment that is in the workforce. So between the age of 20 and 60, which covers a large part of our workforce, they're actually the ones most likely to get COVID-19 at the moment. And if you look at New South Wales, they're actually between 20 and 40 are actually the 2 largest groups at the moment contracting it. So purely just to kind of get rid of the myth that we've kind of had for a long time now that really only older people are getting COVID-19 or, the risks are only to those people that are older. I think we're seeing a much wider spread. In terms of vaccinations as well, just really quickly highlighting that we obviously aren't in line with our original goal set by the federal government in terms of the vaccination rates. That red line is taken from The Guardian, just showing that we're kind of on that trend yellow line, where 70% may be vaccinated by the end of October, 80% middle of November. Obviously, that's subject to kind of vaccination rates, upkeep. So we'll just have to see kind of how that moves, but purely just to show that we're kind of less than halfway through our vaccination journey. In terms of the landscapes, I've said, originally we wanted 80% of the population to be, 100% of the population to be vaccinated by October. Clearly, that's not going to happen, and they've changed those estimates to be roughly 80% of the population of people over the age of 16 to be vaccinated by December, hopefully this year. But again, we'll just need to see if that can be met. In terms of kind of the other current landscape about vaccinations, based on my understanding, currently all Australians over the age of 12 can book in an appointment to get a vaccination, whether that's one or both of the currently available vaccines in Australia at the moment. So I know they just changed it so that children over 12 that don't have any vulnerabilities can book in an appointment after a certain date in September, but still technically they can book in an appointment. So we've just seen this be a huge shift from previously where it was only certain groups that could get it, only certain states that had availability. We're actually seeing a much wider accessibility for vaccinations at the moment. In terms of the flip side for the legal part of it, in July 2021, they announced this indemnity scheme for medical professionals so that they could more freely recommend vaccinations without fear of liability. And then basically last week, there was a disclosure from the federal government in relation to this no-fault COVID-19 vaccine scheme, which enables individuals that might have adverse reactions to a vaccine. And there are certain other criteria. It has to be over $5,000 worth of costs. It needs to be more than just minor. They can actually go through this scheme. So it's removing liability in some part for companies and doctors that are pushing out or incentivizing vaccines. So it is helpful for businesses from that perspective, but it doesn't actually fix the main issue that we have at the moment. In terms of other parts of the country and their states' approaches, we're actually seeing some restrictions get tallied based on whether people are vaccinated or not. So previously, a lot of the restrictions and relaxation of those restrictions are based on other factors such as case numbers. We're actually seeing states move now towards actually looking at restrictions or relaxing those restrictions based on the number of people that are vaccinated or whether you are vaccinated. So New South Wales very recently announced that certain LGAs need to be vaccinated to be able to do certain things under those restrictions. Victoria just announced the other day that if we hit 23 September 2021 and we have that 70% vaccination rate, then construction sector sites can open, but they need to have a 90% to have at least one vaccination if they want 50% capacity. So this is purely just to flag that we're seeing states kind of use vaccination numbers to help with relaxations of restrictions. And it might actually be that some industries are not able to fully come back until certain vaccination rates are achieved. So we're seeing incentivised vaccination programs already by the government, just kind of indirectly. In terms of the actual issue we have at the moment, so all of those indemnity schemes are great, they're helpful, but as employers, this is kind of the crux of the whole issue. So the government hasn't come out and provided an indemnity or a protection for businesses that require vaccinations. So I've put a quote up there from Prime Minister Scott Morrison in August, so last month. It is not the intention of the Commonwealth nor of the states and territories to create any special laws in these areas around mandatory vaccinations by employers. I'm sure employers who are considering this would also be taking their own advice on these matters. This couldn't be more of the handball approach of liability. This is, we can't come in and just indemnify every employer. So we're going to actually leave it to employers to work this out on their own. So that is the unhelpful part, is that each employer needs to kind of carry out their own assessment. There isn't some blanket approach. And I guess the point of this webinar is to kind of take you through exactly what that test is, so you can go away and then carry it out for yourself, and then also just come back to get legal advice to confirm that approach, or if you're unsure. So I'm just going to pass over to Grace to initially kind of talk through whether we should all be considering vaccination policies or whether it's just certain businesses.
Thanks, Andy. So our opinion on this point is that, yes, all employers should be considering whether they need to implement a mandatory vaccination policy. And if that answer is yes, well, then how you actually go about doing that, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the reason for this is because each state and territory does have its own OH&S legislation, and generally employers will need to do two things. So they need to both ensure that the workplace is free from risk to health and safety as far as reasonably practicable, and one of those steps could be a mandatory vaccination policy, depending on the circumstances of your workplace and your activities. But also you owe a duty of care to your workers, which is your employees and your contractors, as well as any visitors to the workplace, to make sure that that is a safe environment. but also not only just the head office or your main office premises, that's also extended to anywhere that you have management or control, which can include making sure that employees who are working from home are working in a safe environment for themselves as well. In terms of, on the flip side, for employees, employees obviously have a legal right to make sure that they feel safe at work and are able to complete their work in a safe environment that's free from risk to health and safety. So while employers are legally required to take those steps, take those reasonable steps to make sure that they're providing this, it's pretty much everyone's responsibility, and everyone owes a duty of care to one another to make sure that they're not acting in a way or not acting in a way, so omissions, which are causing health and safety risks to not only themselves, but to other people in the workplace. Now, in terms of what happens if you do fail to meet these legal obligations, you may, as an employer, not only on a personal liability basis, but also on a corporate basis, be subjecting yourself to significant consequences. And the main one that people tend to focus on is those financial penalties. Now, under the OHS legislation, specifically in Victoria now, penalties can be up to 3.3 million for corporates per contravention, but also hundreds of thousands of dollars for individuals. So decision makers, senior managers, executives, and the board directors who were involved in a contravention or had any foresight over that. There's also, obviously, under the personal liability legislation, negligence claims that can be brought against you for reckless conduct. You may also be subjected to significant reputational damage if you're the subject of any of those claims. Or potentially criminal convictions as well under newly created workplace manslaughter or industrial manslaughter legislation in several states of Australia. But practically as well, you might see an uptick in sort of workers' compensation claims or even your premiums for this type of insurance. So that's pretty much the reason why we say that you should consider this vaccination stance, because of those obligations to make sure that you're eliminating health and safety risks in the workplace as far as reasonably practicable. And mandatory vaccination policies are one way of doing this, but also in the social context of COVID. So as Andy was mentioning before, the workforce is obviously those people sort of between maybe that 20-year-old to maybe around 60, 65 years age of preservation age. So because they're the ones who are under this Delta variant essentially getting the virus a lot higher, and the rates of death and hospitalisation are a lot higher now with the rapid infectious way that Delta is going around the world. All leadership groups need to make sure that they're considering their vaccination stance as part of their OHS procedures and framework at the moment. And if you do go ahead and think about implementing this, if you need to in the circumstances, this sort of policy documented will definitely protect the business in the event that unfortunately someone does contract COVID-19 or comes into contact with COVID-19 in your workplace. Now, flowing on from that, the question on everyone's lips is obviously, can you legally direct employees to get vaccinated? And that's what we're here to obviously talk about today. So in general, you can require a vaccination for your employees and volunteers and workers if one of three things is satisfied. So the first thing, and probably the easiest way to satisfy this, is that the federal or the state government has specifically required it for your sector or your activities. So it changes depending on states. So you're going to have to check your own state's directives, but places like aged care, hotel quarantine, healthcare sectors, there has been specific directives, and I know specifically in New South Wales there has been, around these sectors and the importance of having vaccines here because of the very high risk of contracting the virus, but also the work with vulnerable service recipients as well. The second way, in the absence of any specific government directives, is that your enterprise agreement or your employment contract requires it, which we assume, unless you've been really, really smart and really on the ball about this, a lot of employers won't have this embedded in their documents at the moment. So I think in the absence of both of those 2 points, the thing that everyone's going to be focusing on is whether it's a lawful and reasonable direction in the circumstances of your activities and your business and the employee's duties, whether you're going to be able to mandate vaccinations in the workplace. So in terms of lawful and reasonable directions, they're pretty self-explanatory, but the items behind it are a bit more difficult to understand. So it's a direction that complies with all relevant legislation, including modern awards and enterprise agreement terms, and is reasonable given the circumstances of your business. So it's, as classic legal terminology is specified, it all depends on the case-by-case basis. So there's not going to be one approach that fits everyone, and what's reasonable for one company or organisation based on their activities is not necessarily going to be the case for another. And then going even further, what's going to be lawful and reasonable for one employee may not be for another as well. So in terms of the things that the Commission or a court might consider if a claim came to them around lawful and reasonable directions in the workplace, what they would look at is things like the background leading up to the direction, so the COVID-19 situation in that state or Australia generally, the objectives and the purpose behind the direction, any available alternatives, which one of those is either a recommendation or vaccine incentives, which we'll talk about in a moment. But also the impacts of the direction on others. So can they actually work? Can they make a living? Can they provide for their family? But also a further one is the duties of the worker as well and what they need to do, whether that's within the community and they have contact with them or whether that can be done in an isolated capacity at home. The Ombudsman as well has also released some guidance on the basis of lawful and reasonable directions for vaccines in the workplace. And Andy's going to talk to that advice in a little moment, but it's very helpful for employers to understand what is lawful and reasonable and what's going to be overstepping the mark. In terms of case studies that we've got at the moment, there's nothing out there about COVID-19 vaccinations. So these two cases are the best we've got at the moment. They're both 2021 cases. They were both unfair dismissal claims in the Fair Work Commission at the moment, and they were both around working in aged care. So the first one, the employee refused specifically on medical grounds and was told she can't continue getting shifts until she actually got the vaccine because they had a mandatory vaccination policy in place around flu vaccines. She took all available leave, and then once that leave was exhausted, she was terminated for failing to follow a lawful and reasonable direction of the employer. Now, when it went to the Commission and she lodged the unfair dismissal claim, it was found to be lawful on the basis that the fact that the Queensland government, where Auschcare was based, had specifically given a directive saying that all aged care workers needed to be vaccinated for flu, and also the fact that she was working in a high-risk environment with vulnerable patients. Now, turning to the second one, it's a very sort of similar circumstance. Again, this employee refused on medical grounds. They worked in the aged care sector, and the reason she refused was because she had an adverse reaction to the vaccine previously. The employer asked for medical evidence, she gave dodgy medical evidence, and she was terminated for not being able to perform the inherent requirements of her role, essentially getting the vaccine. Again, the Fair Work Commission, it came before them, and it was found to be a lawful and reasonable direction due to the fact that the evidence that she provided was not contemporaneous with the fact that she got this reaction, and it was not connected in any way that the Commission could see to the flu vaccine. So it was considered a lawful and reasonable direction, and her termination was for a valid reason. Therefore, on the basis of these two recent cases, it is a positive outlook for employers who are seeking to implement those mandatory vaccination policies around COVID. But in the absence of any cases, we just need to keep our eyes on the news at the moment to make sure if we do see any test cases, whether that actually changes our opinion on that or changes the policy that we're going to be implementing. Now I'm going to hand back to Andy to talk more through the 4-step process and the specific test that relates to lawful and reasonable directions and how you can actually consider whether your workplace needs to have a mandatory workplace COVID-19 policy.
Yeah, great. And I think this is kind of, we just went through kind of the law, I guess, in terms of where we're kind of at legally. But sometimes that can be a bit overwhelming. Sometimes it's not super practical. So we thought we'd kind of devise a bit of a 4-step process for all businesses to be able to go through that hopefully makes this kind of process a bit clearer. So first step is categorizing your employees. So it's very unlikely that you would be able to lawfully just create a blanket policy that applies to every single employee in your business, no matter the location, no matter what their role is, just literally everyone must get it no matter what. I think it's really unlikely that would be lawful. So because of that, we need to be a bit more careful or considerate in terms of who we actually have as employees and workers of ours. So the first step for me is to categorize all of your employees into these 4 tiers. So these tiers are actually based on the Fair Work Ombudsman guidance. That Fair Work Ombudsman guidance isn't law, it's not legislation. We can't kind of sit back and rely on it, but it does actually help us with this first step, which is categorizing all of our employees into buckets. So tier 1 is where would fall under all of your employees that have an interaction with an increased risk of being infected with coronavirus. So we're talking about, do they actually deal with vulnerable people? So, you know, for example, employees working in hotel quarantine, aged care, it could be people going into to assist people with certain disabilities and make them more immunocompromised. These are your, do they work with vulnerable people kind of bucket. The second tier is going to be, you know, that vulnerable testing again, but purely more relating to kind of the industry that they're working in. So you're kind of looking at that tier for that one. Tier 3, as we kind of whittle down, the risks are getting lower. So tier 3 is going to be looking at the interaction between any members of the public. So do they have to physically deal with anyone as part of their role? So whether that be customers, whether that be other employees. And then the last tier is employees have minimal face-to-face interaction as part of their normal duties. So if they're working from home, for example, or they're working remotely, or there are very few people ever in the office at the one time, and they're all socially distanced, it's just going to be really important that we can kind of separate all of our employees into these 4 buckets as the first kind of step. The second step is taking a kind of even more considered approach based on the fact that the risks of COVID-19 are actually different state to state. So although we can take those general graphs at the beginning and look at COVID-19 cases across Australia, the risk of someone getting COVID-19 is a lot different in New South Wales at the moment, unfortunately, than it would be in Western Australia, for example. So I would recommend that at each of those buckets, you have subgroups based on where those employees actually are. So you've actually created, for example, you might have 4 employees as part of, you might have 4 employees part of tier 1, but then you might only have 1 of those tier 1 workers in Victoria. So that would be its own Victorian tier 1 bucket. As we kind of go through it, it's just going to be more interesting and more careful, and you're going to be in a better position to defend a claim if you're able to show that you've gone through this really considered approach where you're separating employees based on their role and what they're doing and the contact they have, and then also the states that they're actually working in. Now that we have all of these buckets, and it sounds like a bit of an onerous kind of task, but hopefully you don't have employees in every single state performing every single different type of duty. So this should hopefully be easier. But step 3 is just to analyze each of those subgroups. So for each one, I'd look at what is the risk of COVID-19 for that subgroup. So New South Wales, for example, at the moment, community transmission is very high. That's a much higher risk. Where if it was in WA, there's almost 0 risk at the moment of community transmission. So just useful to know that that's a difference in terms of what the risk is. What is the risk for the people that they interact with? So we spoke before about the tiers. If they're in one of the tiers that deal with vulnerable people, kind of how vulnerable are those people based on the risk of COVID-19 in that state? So if we have information that, say, for example, COVID-19 is moving between certain sectors in the disability team, for example, then that information is very relevant to us because it shows that there's that heightened risk of COVID-19 for those people that they're interacting with. Because as Grace said, we have an obligation to our own employees and their health and safety, but we also have a duty of care to the people that they interact with. So we need to make sure we consider their risks as well. Third point is to consider whether vaccinations are available for that subgroup. So this is less relevant now than it was, but if you've got Victorians, for example, that are unable to get certain vaccines or any vaccines, or the wait is, 3 months' time, then that should be considered in terms of when you make a lawful and reasonable direction and what timeframes you have. And then the last point are there any alternatives? So if you're a tier 4 worker that's working remotely, then it may be that the alternative is to keep working at home. It may be that there might be split shifts that you could do to manage that risk. In WA, for example, with very little community transmission, I think there's a big argument to say that there are many other alternatives besides from mandatory vaccinations that you can do to cover that risk, given it is much smaller. Where in New South Wales, I think it's harder for you to make that case that there are valid alternatives. So I would still just recommend going through all of these questions for each subgroup. 4th step, and it's always kind of a bias for a lawyer to say, talk to a lawyer, but we've seen it with SPC recently when they came out with their mandatory vaccination policy for all employees as a blanket. One of their defences was they came out and said that they actually got legal advice and that legal advice supported their position. And I think if we are to make a decision as a board, as a leadership group to introduce a mandatory vaccination policy, it will provide you with a lot more comfort and assurance if you're able to have written legal advice that sits behind that decision that helps clarify exactly what the risks are and then also how you can minimize those. So that's kind of our 4-step process, I guess, just for everyone to think about going through for their employees. In terms of the implementation, I'll just pass over to Grace to go through this in terms of kind of what potential things we can actually look at.
Thanks, Andy. So in terms of what we think you should consider before implementing a mandatory vaccination policy in your business, there is a lot of things to sort of consolidate before actually taking that step. So some of these things include, when are you going to require compliance? So as Andy was saying, some people don't necessarily have eligibility, or there might not be supply of certain vaccines as well. So you need to make sure that you understand when they can get their first shot, when they can get their second shot, and put the deadline at a reasonable point as well. Also, what you should do if someone refuses. So this might be on their own principles or values. This might be on medical or cultural grounds. So you need to have sort of a contingency plan on how you're going to deal with that. And same thing with non-compliance as well, whether you're going to take a heavy hand or a soft approach to that, depending on what the reason for non-compliance is. Additionally, you need to consider whether it's going to be a global policy, so it's going to cover all of your workers, or whether this is going to be targeted to certain employees based on the different criteria that Andy pointed out. So what tier they sit in, but also where they might be working as well, and whether there's a higher risk of contracting COVID there. Finally, you'll need to look at also what evidence you're going to be requiring to monitor compliance and how you're going to approach that, but then also how you're going to manage your workforce in the interim, especially if you're sort of sitting in that maybe tier 1 or tier 2 category with your employees, where they need to actually be there in person or in the office in person to perform the services that your business provides. In terms of what we recommend you doing in practice, we recommend that any mandatory vaccination policy needs to be put in writing, preferably in a document that can be referred to by the employees and by yourself. So it's going to be important to implement it in that way, either through a document, as we were saying, a statement, or even a communication to your employees who are going to need to be vaccinated, so that you can refer to that. And this could be an email if you really wanted to, just to make sure that people understand what's being required of them and how they can comply with that. So things like the timeframes, you need to make sure that it's a direction and not a request. Otherwise, if they don't comply, there may not be legal recourse to take disciplinary action. But also you need to make sure that they understand sort of what the steps are if they don't comply, what evidence you're going to require, and also who they can contact if they do have any concerns or questions about the direction. In the instance that someone does refuse, it's going to be important that you take it with a grain of salt, essentially. So it might be that they are just doing it on principle. It might be that there's medical or cultural reasons behind it. And so it's going to be important that you consult with them and you understand what their concerns and reservations are about getting the vaccine. If it's for medical reasons, it sort of falls into a slightly different category, because you might consider potentially asking them for specific evidence, so a medical certificate from a medical practitioner, so that you can make a decision whether they're going to be safe to actually return to the workplace if they fall into one of those top tier sort of activities. But then in other circumstances, if they don't have valid grounds and they don't comply with the direction, well, then you need to consider sort of whether you're going to take it one step further and consider disciplinary action for not complying with the direction. In terms of your evidence requirements, there's specific privacy and confidentiality implications if you sort of misuse any evidence that they provide. And so we definitely recommend that you ask them for reasonable evidence and sort of put the ball in their court to decide on what they are capable of giving you. Common examples of this might be things like a screenshot of their immunisation history. They might be able to potentially get a doctor's letter or a medical certificate to say that they have been vaccinated, or potentially a stat dec, which these items can obviously be already used for things like personal leave, and so these can obviously be seen as reasonable evidence that they have been vaccinated. Now, the only point that we do want to make, though, is that employers need to make sure that they have a process for handling and for storing that documentation. Now, because it's very sensitive information related to employees' medical records, we do recommend not holding on to it for longer than needed and making sure that it's securely kept at all times. And potentially you might decide as a business as well that just citing the documentation is enough for you as well, but just making sure that you have some sort of safeguards around that so that confidentiality and privacy is not breached. Now, in terms of some of the alternatives as well to implementing a mandatory vaccination policy, the main alternatives are essentially that you can provide a recommendation to your employees to actually get that vaccine, or you can potentially provide an incentive, which a lot of employers are considering at the moment. And in our experience, that has been a range of different things. Now, if you are thinking about providing an incentive, a lot of employers are asking, well, now what can you provide? And the most common ones from our experience have been things like one-off bonuses or additional paid leave as well. In terms of how you communicate this, though, and how you disseminate this, it's going to be related to specific regulations that the Therapeutic Goods Administration has actually come out with in recent weeks. And this specifically talks about how you can communicate this to your employees, when the incentive's actually triggered, and also what employers can provide as an incentive. So just going on to the next slide, in terms of the communications, they need to be consistent with government advice. So you can't be promoting falsehoods about the vaccine or promoting false facts. And this needs to comply with both the federal and the state or territory that you're in, the guidance that they've provided. They need to reference the need for the employee to get medical advice from a medical practitioner in relation to their own circumstances. So you can't just say, go and get it. They need to actually speak to a doctor or a medical practitioner before they receive the vaccine. It needs to be inclusive. So they need to apply retrospectively, essentially, for if anyone has become fully vaccinated, so gotten the 2 doses before you implement this incentive scheme. So you need to be able to provide it to them if they provide you with reasonable evidence. And also, you can't preference or refer to one vaccine over another as better or worse. You need to only refer to them in a very generic sense as a COVID-19 vaccine. So you can't talk about them as an mRNA vaccine or AstraZeneca, Pfizer and the like. It needs to be very general in nature. In terms of if you're thinking about providing monetary incentives, which are overwhelmingly the most common benefit, they can only be provided once the employee has been fully vaccinated. So you can't provide sort of a part payment on first dose, a part payment on second dose overall as a bonus. It's only triggered once they've actually gotten the 2 doses. In terms of what you can provide itself, pretty much you can provide anything that you decide as an incentive for being vaccinated, but in classic legal terms, except for alcohol, where it encourages rapid or excessive consumption, tobacco and medicines. And the reasons around this from the TGA is because these are heavily regulated products and industries as well. What happens if your employee is already vaccinated? So we already talked a little bit about this. They're going to be eligible for your incentive, essentially, because they've obviously already satisfied the requirements. And as long as they can provide you with reasonable evidence of that, consistent with the TGA's regulations, you need to be able to provide that incentive to them. On the flip side, we also think that you should consider making this available also to those who do provide you with medical evidence that they reasonably cannot get the vaccine. And the reason for this is because it sort of minimises the risks of potential risks and liabilities that are going to eventuate, especially around sort of those discrimination complaints or employee claims. And that actually flows well into the next bit, which is about potential risks and liabilities. So again, these 4 on the slides are the overwhelming risks and liabilities. So you're looking at potentially a discrimination complaint either at state and territory level or a discrimination complaint at the federal level because of the broad nature of how COVID vaccines will flow into the different protected attributes, so things around health, illness, they've disclosed to you disabilities. And then if you're looking more towards the Commission, you may be subject to either a general protections claim or an unfair dismissal claim, as those 2 flu vaccination cases showed. So for a general protections claim, which the compensation is actually uncapped, so there's a significantly higher risk of compensation being paid by the employer where the direction to get vaccinated has not been lawful and reasonable. But a general protections claim is on the basis that the employer took adverse action against them, either terminated them, stopped giving them shifts, for example, on the basis of that protected attributes, so illness, disability, health. Whereas unfair dismissal claims, which are capped at 26 weeks wages, it's a minimised risk of compensation then, but this might be a more common claim because it's on the basis that their termination was harsh, unjust, unfair, and then will flag for the Commission to consider, well, was the direction to get vaccinated lawful and reasonable in the circumstances? All right, the next bit's just talking about our top tips and recommendations for employers, as there's obviously a lot of practical tips in this space that are going to be very useful, and Andy's going to talk to you guys about that.
If we just kind of go through kind of step by step, kind of what are our main tips in this space. The first one is to, just as a first step, sit down as a leadership group and kind of go through that 4-step test that we went through. So before we kind of run off and just implement a policy, I think it's really important for the leadership group to really consider each of those factors as part of the 4-step test, create those different buckets of employees, consider whether we can provide a mandatory vaccination policy direction to those. And then the second part is, do we want to or should we? Because it may be that you can provide a lawful and reasonable direction to get vaccinated, but it might be that you just decide to go down a different route. So this test is really important because you first need to work out, can you do it? And then the second step is, should you? If you work out that you do want to go ahead with one, it's really just important for the leadership group to map out all those different practicalities in terms of how you implement it. So we've chatted about it before, but do you go down a policy route? Do you go down an email communication? Who do you apply to? Who do you talk to about it? When do those dates come in terms of when you want them to be vaccinated, in terms of first shot and second shot? All of those just need to be really crystal clear. Also trying to think as a leadership group, kind of what happens if someone has a concern or question and they don't want to get vaccinated. So it was chatted about before. I think no matter the reason why they don't want it, I really recommend someone sit down with them and to try to talk through and get more information from them about why, try to really understand what their concerns are. Because a lot of the times you might be able to actually provide them with information that relays those concerns. And then if they actually provide a reason that gives you concern that you think is valid, you can always ask for more evidence about that. So you can then go away and consider it. If you don't think it's valid, then you can obviously go ahead with disciplinary. If it is valid, then you can consider whether you make an exception or consider alternatives for that person. But it's just really good for a leadership group to make a decision on all of those points. Second tip is to consult. So you'll see unions around Australia say that, the first step is consultation. You must consult. And to be honest, with OH&S, you generally do need to consult with your employees when you're introducing an OH&S measure. So I just really recommend, if you've already made the decision or what your proposal is as part of that leadership group, it's good to then just put that to your employees first before pushing out the policy. So you would tell them through kind of what those concerns are, why you think vaccinations are reasonable, what you're proposing to do in terms of being mandatory, if you're offering incentives or anything like that, kind of what those parts are, just so employees feel like they're part of the process and they can raise concerns with you. They might actually also be able to offer alternatives that you haven't considered. So it's just good for this to be part of that rollout process, is to consult with them. The tip is around privacy and confidentiality. Any employer that it deals with mandatory vaccinations is going to get medical information back. It's just a reality that they're going to get confirmation around vaccination status. And because of our privacy obligations, we just need to make sure we're really conscious that it's highly sensitive and to consider all the protections we can put in place to make sure that that information isn't leaked. Because if at the end of the day, in touch wood, it is leaked or somehow it gets out, you really want to be confident that you can look back and say, these are all the protections we put in place, and this is how we comply with our obligations. And as Grace mentioned earlier, really important not to hold on to this information for any longer than you need to. And a lot of our clients are just citing and then deleting content and then keeping a register in terms of maybe say yes or no. That's really secure. Fourth tip is to just review the policy as things change. So what the position is at the moment is we're much more likely and able to issue mandatory vaccination directions in at least Victoria and New South Wales because of the situation right now, where 4 months ago, that might have been very different. So we always just need to be conscious that a lawful and reasonable direction is assessed at the time that we actually give the direction. So it's not just a forever kind of decision that we can always do. But I'd also just flag that if an organisation wanted to introduce a mandatory vaccination policy, in the same vein, it's actually quite a good time to seriously consider it, because the risks are so high at the moment. It's more likely that now would be a better time to introduce a mandatory vaccination policy than, say, in 2 months' time if cases go way down, 4 months' time if vaccination rates are already higher. It actually could be an opportune time to seriously consider what the organisation wants to do around vaccinations, just because the risks are actually high right now. And to consider, if things do change, that it might need to relax its mandatory vaccination policy or change it. because again, what is lawful and reasonable now may not be lawful and reasonable in 2 months' time. The other part, or the other tip, is just to protect the business with documents. And I know it's a classic lawyer thing to talk about legal documents, but your mandatory vaccination policy will be much safer if there's a requirement in a contract of employment for them to get vaccinated, if there's a requirement in the position description for them to be vaccinated. So say, for example, you have caseworkers that go out on site to aged care facilities, hospitals. If one of the requirements for that role is to be vaccinated and to comply with any directions of those facilities or venues, then you're actually in a much easier position to direct them to comply with it, because they've basically agreed to that direction as part of their PD. It also helps us because we can say it's an inherent requirement of their role to do that. What's tough at the moment is that we can't just issue out new contracts of employment PDs for people to sign. A lot of employers just won't agree to just accepting this additional obligation. But at least thinking forward for all new employees to seriously consider whether we do want to add in a requirement into particular PDs and whether we do want to add them into particular contracts of employment, so that if we are to make a vaccination policy in the future, or we already have, we're just better protected because we're more covered on multiple fronts. And obviously, as Grace mentioned before, if we do introduce a mandatory vaccination direction, it's great to have a policy behind it that makes it really clear about what we're doing. One again, and it's the second time I've said this, but just really, if you're unsure, if you want to introduce a mandatory vaccination policy and think the risks are high for you, really important to get legal advice so you can then rely on it and refer back to moving forward. It's just a really complicated area at the moment, and I've gone through that test with you in terms of how we approach it, but you'll be better protected if you've got legal advice that you can actually rely on. So now we're at the Q&A section, and we've got about 15 minutes or so. So I can see some people have already put questions in the Q&A box at the top, so I appreciate those. And just encourage anyone right now to please flick them through into the Q&A box and I'll go through them. I'll keep them all anonymous, so please don't worry that I'll shout out any names. And then also I'll put a slide up at the end of this with our contact details if you want to ask any questions directly, not in this forum. So it might be good just to go through the first one. So first question is in relation to individual liability. So we mentioned earlier as one of our slides that officers, directors, people that are directly involved in contraventions of OH&S laws can be personally liable in certain situations. And the question was, can individuals as employees, for example, be liable for their own actions? So not because they're managed or controlling others, but purely just based on, can individuals, because we owe duty of care to everyone, can we be held personally liable? And the question, or the answer will be, probably not. Under OH&S legislation, they might be found to have breached particular provisions in terms of their individual obligations, but it's very, very rare for individuals in that context to ever face penalties under that. They much more likely go after the entity as a whole, and then also after the people that had management or control. I've never seen it personally in terms of an employee being personally liable for one of their actions from an OH&S perspective. It does relate to employment though. We have many situations where employees have been validly terminated from their employment because they have failed their own OH&S obligations. So they have behaved very risky, or they've exposed others to harm. That is when lawfully it can be relevant. But in terms of kind of individual penalties for individuals for what they specifically did to others, it's unlikely that they would be pinned. We're more talking about that higher level that have management and control. The second question is, if an employee is injured or dies as a result of getting a vaccine because a policy has been mandated by an employer, is the employer liable? I think what is really helpful, and it's a great question to be first, is that this new liability scheme that they've just announced, if it's implemented properly, it allows those employees to go through this scheme and makes it easy for them to avoid litigation completely. So this scheme, the only benefit of this scheme really to me is this exact situation. So if you were to mandate or encourage people to get a vaccination and they were to either die or get injured as a result of that, this new liability scheme should largely protect you as an employer. And that's why they wanted to introduce it, because they're looking in the future of making employers potentially having hubs for vaccinating not only their employees, but others, to make those officers available. So it does provide you with that protection in case someone were to be one of that, 0.001 that do have adverse reactions that do get more serious. that you're actually protected as an employer. What you're not protected by, obviously, is if you were to terminate an employee because they failed to follow a mandatory vaccination policy. And as we've set out, there are those risks with that. But no, purely as just an adverse action to a vaccine, if this policy is implemented correctly, then we should be largely covered. So the next one is, does an employer actually have the right to request or even cite confirmation of vaccine status, or can an employee refuse? It's a really great question. There is some information from DHHS in terms of customers going to stores and whether you can ask them for medical evidence to let them in if you've got a policy that they must wear a mask or must have vaccinations. It's different in the employee setting though, because if we've made a lawful and reasonable direction for them to do something, and in this case, let's say that's to get a mandatory vaccination, it's actually impossible for us to know if they've even complied with our request unless they can provide evidence. So I'm really comfortable in employers, if they have met that first threshold in terms of it is lawful and reasonable, then I'm really comfortable with them asking for medical evidence, because otherwise we can't actually know if they've complied. And that's pretty consistent. Normally under legislation for personal carers leave, for example, if they want to take that leave, then we can make lawful and reasonable directions to get medical evidence from them, and they have to provide that. The only thing I'd just say is I think at first instance, we should be flexible in terms of what that evidence is. I wouldn't want us to say that we must get, every single page of a report setting out their vaccination status or every page of their MyGov site that has information we just don't need. We really only need and should be asking for specifically evidence on, are they vaccinated? Beyond that, we really want to steer clear of it. And as I said before, we should have systems in place to better protect them. So we need to be able to provide clarity and comfort to those employees that I know you might be uncomfortable providing this vaccination status to us, but here are all the things we're doing to make sure that it's safe and make sure it won't get leaked. And also it might be just telling them that once we get this certain information, then we may be deleting it or we may be putting it on a really secure file so that no one can get access. The more that we just try to talk to employees and try to relay their concerns first, hopefully we don't then need to get to the step of actually disciplining them for not providing that evidence, and we can actually resolve it. But if we do make a lawful and reasonable direction and we have asked for evidence that's more flexible in terms of what they can provide, whether that's even a stat deck, and they fail to provide that, then my opinion was it's likely we can actually take disciplinary action against them. And normally that would be a first warning to set out exactly what our rationale is for why they need to provide it. So another question is, could you offer an alternative for those people who refuse to get the vaccination, e.g. use of PPE, where an unvaccinated employee would need to wear a face mask, gloves, etc. 100% of the time, where vaccinated employees would not? It's a really great question, and it will obviously be very specific to exactly the situation where those employees are working and what the risks are. I think those alternatives that you just mentioned in terms of PPE, you might find based on the state you're in and who they're dealing with, that actually those PPE equipment do cover the risks as much as possible. So they're actually okay that they're not vaccinated. And it might actually be a good idea to think of that as an alternative if someone can't actually get vaccinated for medical reasons or refuses, is to think through, well, can we just offer an alternative to cover that particular risk? There might be situations though where it doesn't matter the amount of PPE that you put in, the risks are still too high. For example, if you're in New South Wales sending people into particular very closed spaces, for example, with very vulnerable people, where you can't necessarily control the vulnerable people and what they do, then it's likely that no matter what PPE you have, the risk may still be too high. So I think in terms of alternatives, think about PPE, think about split shifts, think about social distancing, think about whether they can work from home, think about sharing office spaces from, some days no one's in, some days one person's in. I think those are things you can think about, but it'll really just be industry specific, it'll really be environmental specific, and just what actually makes sense for you. Because there isn't, I guess, a set list of what are the alternatives. It's just more thinking through what you can think of based on those factors. And then also, if you're consulting, you could ask the employee if there are any alternatives. Again, if we're trying to keep the relationship alive, make sure that we're kind of continuing this positive relationship with our employees, you can actually go to them like, I've really tried to think through alternatives. These are the ones I've come up with, but I don't think they cover it for X, Y reasons. Can you think of any others that you can give me that we might be able to think about? Again, the more we involve them, the less likely we are for them to think that we're just taking some heavy-handed, really sort of a detrimental approach to their rights and entitlements. One of the questions we have next was, is it reasonable to direct employees to work at the office in the current climate if an authorised workplace and in the absence of a vaccination policy? So this again will be very dependent on exactly where we are and what the office space is in terms of what those risks are. If you're working in the office at the moment, obviously you're in one of the states that's allowed, or you're part of one of those sectors where it's allowed as part of those lockdown restrictions. There is always going to be a risk if we direct people to work somewhere and then they end up getting COVID-19, that we will be liable for that. So I just want us to really be clear and go through that 4-step process in terms of, can we require them to get vaccinated? Should we require them to get vaccinated? I think it's unlikely if they're just working in an office with no contact with others, or the contact's very, very minimal, that we can mandatorily require them to get a vaccination. I think that's just unlikely unless you've got very unique situations. So be more just thinking through what other alternatives could we use, or could we potentially just try to encourage or incentivize people to get vaccinated. But I think it's unlikely if they're just office workers and you've done everything else from a COVID safe plan perspective in terms of social distancing, masks, hand sanitizers, for example, that we would be able to direct employers to get it in that situation. But again, happy to chat offline, but that would just be kind of the preliminary look. In terms of one of the questions, is there in draft legislation in New South Wales that would hold an employer liable for any adverse actions or deaths caused by a vaccine? There is a bunch of legislation floating around that's proposed at the moment. None that I've seen that's very close to being put through. So at the moment, I think we just have to act on the information we have, which is the laws that we have at the moment, and just monitor those situations. But this isn't something that, say, tomorrow would be part of the law. We do have that scheme, though, federally, in terms of them coming in with that no fault, which we should monitor as well in terms of liability for businesses and for people that are encouraging vaccines. But no, at the moment, there's nothing that I would say you should not carry out the 4-step test until, say, for example, new legislation comes in. So those are all the questions that we have just there. We've got another 5 minutes, so if anyone wanted to jump in and throw one in now, then absolutely more than happy to and welcome to. Otherwise, I'll just put on our next slide in terms of our contact details. If any questions do pop up and you'd like to just raise them, please feel free to reach out. Those are our contact details there. We did just have a question come in as well, which I'll just answer really quickly. So yeah, the question says, you refer to risk and it sounds like you're referring to the risk of getting COVID. However, there is an argument that the risk of adverse reaction or death from the vaccine itself may actually be a greater risk. Definitely not being a proponent of providing medical advice. A court will look at, for any OH&S obligation, based on all the information you had at the time, what would a reasonable person do? So a court and commission would look at all of the medical evidence that goes for vaccinations, what are the benefits of those, and they'll also look at if there's evidence to say that there's an adverse reaction or risk. So it won't be up to us as a business or up to an individual to make that assessment as to which advice it wants to prefer. The court or commission will make that decision. And if there is overwhelming scientific evidence to say that getting a vaccination protects you, and it is a better protection than the adverse risk of getting a vaccine, then that's the advice that they'll go by. So I guess I can't provide just a strict answer on kind of that particular question, but I think I would just be mindful when a court or commission looks at all the information before it, will it be impossible for them to say that they shouldn't have got vaccinated, or is there an opening for that? So again, I'm not going to make my own mind up in this situation. I just think they'll look at all the information before them. So it's a really great question. And I think we should monitor what that information is as it goes forward, but it's very likely that they'll look at the overwhelming amount of evidence leaning one way or the other to make that decision. Another question we just had through is workers' compensation available in Victoria where the vaccine is incentivised, not mandated, and someone suffers an adverse reaction. So my understanding at the moment is we haven't had a workers' comp claim in relation to COVID-19 that I'm aware of. So I'm not sure whether the insurer would say whether that particular incident is related to the workplace or related to their duties. If we're just encouraging or incentivizing, I think it's unlikely. I think what's much more likely is that they would go through this new scheme to try to get really easy access to compensation for those adverse reactions. So again, another benefit of this new scheme is it might avoid even people claiming through workers' compensation. But I would think it's very unlikely at the moment that they would be able to access workers' compensation entitlements purely because as a business we've said or incentivized that we encourage them to get a vaccine. Because I guess there's an argument that it's actually not a requirement of their role if we're just incentivizing or encouraging. And arguably, it's, unless we're making them do it at the workplace, it's harder for that link to be created. So I think the answer would likely be no. Okay, I think that's all probably we have time for in terms of questions. Thank you so much for coming again today. We are 2 minutes early, which is a real benefit in terms of this situation where you can talk on and on. But thank you again for attending, and please reach out on these contact details if you have any other questions. Otherwise, I'm sure I'll speak to you all soon. Thanks again.